the Iraqis asked the Americans to leave the country several times, and it seems that the leadership of the U.S. thinks they are a desired guest in Iraq, that they have to stay there somehow forever. It's like they came there illegally and they don't want to leave the country. The reason for that is because they have to secure the interests of the U.S. and Israel in the north, especially in Erbil. Erbil is a very important region in Iraq. It's rich with fuel. And this fuel business is enriching the corporations and also sending some of its fuel to Israel.
It's January 25th, 2024. And not only is the U.S. still bombing Yemen, even though Biden has admitted to the world that the strikes aren't really doing anything to significantly harm Ansar Allah's capabilities to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea. Oh, but the U.S. is now also once again bombing Iraq. And this time around, their attacks have led to a sharp rebuke from Iraq's prime minister, who is noting that the U.S. is violating the country's sovereignty and just continuing to escalate tensions in the region. It's no secret that the U.S. military presence isn't wanted in Iraq. It's also not wanted in Syria, where the U.S. continues to illegally occupy the country. But of course, if you ask Washington, they claim that they're in the region in order to stop the resurgence of ISIS, a group that notably did not exist before the U.S. presence in the region did, and before they created a vacuum in a number of ways and allowed extremist groups to flourish, even helped them to do so in order to achieve Washington's aims. So what are the concerns moving forward? Are we going to see the U.S. finally give in and pull out its troops from the region? Or is there concern that we could see an increased U.S. presence as it claims that it's needed to fight those groups that it has helped flourish in the past? We discussed all of that earlier with a special guest, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Kevork Almassian, a political commentator and founder of Syriana Analysis. Kevork, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to talk to you about the latest here. I know that the U.S. has launched 9 rounds of strikes in Yemen in less than 2 weeks, even with Biden admitting that they aren't doing anything significant to harm Ansar Allah's capabilities. And as a result, the U.S. has now been added to the list of ships the Houthis are targeting in the Red Sea. Is there a concern that the U.S. is going to continue to increase tensions with Yemen in order to make it look like it's doing something?
Actually, I believe it was Einstein who said stupidity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. And they have been trying this for over a decade now, around a decade with Yemen, first with the Saudi and the Emirati participation using the American weaponry against Yemen. And they tried for many years, and they turned Yemen into the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world, according to the UN. And there is a famine, there is starvation. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And they did all they can. And now the US Army, because they have to do something about it, if they don't flex their muscles in the region, then it will also be interpreted as a weakness. So in my opinion, the decision makers in Washington are between 2 options: inaction, which will be interpreted as a weakness, and action, which will flare the fires in the region. And unfortunately for the planners in Washington, D.C., Yemen and the Ansar Allah movement, they do not fight in the cities and they do not fight in certain, let's say, military installations. They are in mountainous areas. They are fighting very difficult warfare for the Americans to detect, and very also expensive for the Americans to use their technologies, their drones to detect their movements, collect information, and then hit. Therefore, the results of these attacks, as we can see nowadays, is counterproductive for the Americans in 2 ways. One, the Houthis or the Ansar Allah movement, they are now also, because of the American bombing, striking American cargo ships in the region, where the fact was before these strikes, they were only targeting the Israeli-affiliated cargo ships. And secondly, they are sending a message to the entire international public, telling them that there is no difference between us and Israel. And we are here acting on behalf of Israel to protect the international trade that they are talking about nowadays. And this will only increase the complicity of the United States in the ongoing genocide in the Gaza Strip. Remember that if the ICJ rules in a year or 2 or 3 that Israel violated the Genocide Convention, the United States, Britain, Germany, and other governments who assisted Israel in its onslaught against the Palestinians in Gaza, whether through arms, intelligence support, using the veto, going to the ICJ as a third party in defense of Israel, bombing Yemen, which is blocking the imposing an embargo on the Israeli cargo ships. These parties will be considered complicit, and there will be legal repercussions against the current officials and those decision makers. However, because we know that the Americans will use a veto power in the UN Security Council, well, if the ICJ rules that Israel violated the Genocide Convention, in any ways, even if they used it, I think this is a lose game for the Americans, because if they use the veto power, they will be standing naked in front of the international public that the rules-based order is nothing but an hegemonic tool for the United States and the Americans. And if they don't use the veto power, then their closest ally in the region will be convicted as a genocide perpetrator. So I think the position of the Americans is very, very dire. And if I don't want to put myself in their shoes, but from their perspective, they think that the action bombing Yemen has less repercussions than not bombing Yemen, because the United States as a power, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, they have seen every problem as a nail. So every solution was a hammer, right? So if they don't act now, it will be interpreted as a weakness. And they have to send this message to the rising powers, to the regional powers, to all the powers who have aspirations to become independent, that the United States is still here and they can use hard power to inflict damage against the enemies and restore the balance of power in its favor. But remember what's happening, because nothing is changing in the region, right? So all these flex of muscles in the region, imagine if it was happening 2 decades ago, every country would have had shaken legs, right? They would just submit to the American demands. But nowadays, it's not the case, because there are alternative powers that these countries and these movements can rely on economically, financially, militarily. Therefore, we can see the gradual, I would say, decline of the US hegemonic status in the region. And accordingly, we see other countries like Saudi Arabia diversifying relationship between East and West. The UAE is doing the same thing. And we can even see how the Chinese are investing in different parts of the world. And this week I saw huge news that China has built the first fast railway system in Chile, which was, by the way, dismantled by Pinochet in the 70s, who was installed by the CIA back then in a military coup, who dismantled all the railway of the country. And now the Chinese are coming and building this stuff back. So this is a remarkable change, that the people can see the difference of approach between the alternative powers under a multipolar world compared to the American one, which was a unipolar one.
Yeah, and you make a really great point there when it comes to the US influence and the way that we're seeing that change. And I know we're also seeing that over in Iraq as well. That has been a big one because, of course, the US has been involved in Iraq ever since it invaded back in 2003 and obviously before then. But right now you have the US, it's launching strikes in Yemen. Well, it's also launching strikes against groups in Iraq. And you've got the Iraqi prime minister responding with a statement accusing Washington of blatantly violating his country's sovereignty and contributing to a reckless escalation of regional violence. Now, these are strong words, but could we actually see Iraq moving to finally, once and for all, expel U.S. troops from their country?
the Iraqis asked the Americans to leave the country several times, and it seems that the leadership of the U.S. thinks they are a desired guest in Iraq, that they have to stay there somehow forever. It's like they came there illegally and they don't want to leave the country. The reason for that is because they have to secure the interests of the U.S. and Israel in the north, especially in Erbil. Erbil is a very important region in Iraq. It's it's rich with fuel. And this fuel business is enriching the corporations and also sending some of its fuel to Israel. So the withdrawal from entire Iraq is illogical from their perspective, from the American perspective, unless they secure the security of Erbil, and the the central government in Iraq or in Baghdad would not approach Erbil. So there has to be a deal between Erbil and the central government in Iraq. However, with the increasing number of airstrikes by the American side, I'm just checking the public mood, right? I go to Iraqi, for example, Facebook pages. I just read the comments, etc., just to see in Arabic what the people speak. And you can scroll down with hundreds of commentaries. And I think the U.S. forces are the people feeling increasing animosity against the American forces there. And this will lead only to increasing number of people joining militias in Iraq to fight against the American presence. I mean, remember, the U.S. presence in Iraq is a magnet for people who would join militias and use violence against the Americans. The presence of the American forces generates resistance. Like, were it not for the Americans, all these groups would not exist before 2003, right? And the same thing happened in Syria after the destruction of Syria. So this public mood shift can be managed, of course, by the government, but the prime minister, because he has also better ties, let's say, with Iran, so they are increasing the pressure on the Americans that they want to kick the American forces out. Now, the file of Iraq and Syria are interconnected. The Americans cannot withdraw from Iraq and stay in Syria, right? They will be isolated. They will be like an island surrounded by hostile entities or hostile players in the region. So this is a big package. If they are going to withdraw from Iraq, they have to withdraw from Syria. But they can withdraw from Syria without withdrawing from Iraq because their main base is in Iraq. And the reinforcement that comes to Syria comes from Iraq. The food, the medicine, the equipment, and soldiers, fighters, etc., come from Iraq to Syria, and now we can see that there is a shifting mood in the region, especially after the increased attacks against American forces. People in the intelligence community, in the military community in Washington D.C. are raising a very logical question: what is our end game? Like, what is the strategy of the United States in Syria, right? Okay, you have 900 troops there, you occupy the oil fields, but till when? How long can we stay in Syria? For how long can we steal the oil? And for how long can we preserve the lives of the American soldiers there? And what if the Syrian side, or they call it Iran-linked militias, what if these parties start using more sophisticated weaponry? Because until this moment in Syria, these so-called Iran-linked groups, they are firing unguided rockets. They didn't use, let's say, precision missiles, unlike in Iraq. In Iraq, they are using ballistic missiles. They are using precision missiles. And when the Iranians hit in Erbil, the alleged headquarters of the Mossad, they used sophisticated and let's say not laser guided, but GPS guided missiles. So these attacks and the endangerment of the livelihood of the American soldiers there has to be a concrete answer. What is the strategy of the United States? If they don't have one, then they have to withdraw gradually, and they have to allow for the Arabic countries to reconcile with Iran. So there are non-state actors and state actors in the region would also come together and start dealing between each other. The presence of the US in the region is it's an obstacle for these parties to deal among each other. There is always this fear-mongering by, of course, these Washington-linked pundits I was reading one today in the, I think this is in the Foreign Policy by Charles Lister. He says, America is planning to withdraw from Syria and create a disaster. So this is how they argue. If the Americans withdraw, there will be a disaster. But the experience on the ground indicates that before the American presence, there was no disaster, right? It's the presence of the Americans that generated resistance, created power vacuum, which led to the rise of the terrorist groups in the region. Name me one terrorist group before 2003 in Iraq. You cannot. Name me one terrorist group in Syria before 2011. You cannot. I mean, all these terrorist groups became notorious thanks to the power vacuum, like in Libya, right? So, of course, the Americans are there trying to secure their own interests and also the Israeli interests. But at the end of the day, they have to prioritize their the files. So they have Israel in their hands now in the Gaza Strip. They have Ukraine and they have Taiwan. Those are the three main topics that they have to focus if I'm an American strategist. Therefore, I think Syria and Iraq have become more on a periphery of their priorities and not as a core of a priority. And we will see in the next months, more voices coming from Washington, D.C., calling for withdrawal from Syria. And if Biden wants to score a point against Trump in this regard, so that Trump won't use the issue of anti-war movement and say, I'm an anti-war and I'm going to withdraw from here and there, Biden can take that file from the hands of Trump and withdraw from at least Syria in the foreseeable future in order to score points against Trump, that he is not a war hawk and that he's just managing the files correctly. And then what is going to happen, that Trump will capitalize on it and he will say that he withdrew from Syria in a chaotic way like he did in Afghanistan. In either way, they will play these games against each other. But I think Biden has to withdraw from Syria for the sake of his soldiers and for the sake of the Syrian people. They don't have an exit. They don't have an end game. They don't have a strategy. They're just starving the Syrian people, which is sadistic. You know, like 20 million people are starving below the poverty line. Because the U.S. doesn't allow them to use their fuel and doesn't allow them to use their wheat fields. I think we have to amplify these voices. And thanks to you also that more people will know about this case, because most people do not know that the Americans have occupation forces in other countries and they block the access of ordinary people like myself, like my parents, like my friends, like my relatives in Syria, to benefit from our natural resources. Therefore, we have to import. We are oil, not like very rich in oil, but we had enough oil to operate our factories and to heat our homes. And now we don't have that. So how will the people live under such circumstances? I think the people in the United States should care a little bit more about also the Syrians, as they do nowadays about the Palestinians.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you're bringing it up there, I'm looking at Joe Biden and thinking about his past as the vice president under the Obama administration. And I remember how badly Obama and Biden wanted to get rid of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Now, they did not succeed in that. Of course, everything that they did harmed mainly the Syrian people, but it did not lead to Assad being overthrown like they wanted. And when it came to the strategy of being in the region, their excuse was always, we have to deal with ISIS, this group that magically popped up out of nowhere and had, weapons and Toyota trucks and everything. And that's still what they are saying now. They're like, we have to make sure there's not a resurgence of ISIS, even though obviously Assad's government is fighting ISIS. Russia has helped to fight ISIS. No one in this region wants ISIS to be there except arguably the US. Is there concern that we're going to see some sort of resurgence of a group like ISIS or something similar in the region? Or do you think that the US has gotten to the point now where it's trying to get out of the Middle East, trying to focus on Ukraine and Taiwan, and it's more so Israel that is kind of dragging them back into the conflicts there?
The real question here is how did ISIS become a strong military force in Syria, because Obama and Clinton, they decided to get rid of Assad, and they thought that through political pressure and through compromises by regional powers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, coming and talking and whispering in the ears of Assad, that he will leave power. And Assad was very determined to not to leave power, because he knew that if he leaves power, they will orchestrate elections and bring an American puppet to power. So when he didn't leave, they started arming the insurgents. And this started in 2011. So the program of the CIA was titled Timber Sycamore. And they dumped weaponry to Syria worth tens of billions of dollars, more than in Ukraine, by the way, in Syria. And what they did is basically they created this imaginary group called the Free Syrian Army. And they said those are the deserters from the Syrian army fighting against the Assad regime, right? But this group was the middleman, just like Zelensky is the middleman nowadays in Syria. And they give the weapons to this Free Syrian Army. And the Free Syrian Army, they distribute it to radical groups such as Al-Nusra Front, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And if they don't do that, these groups were already more powerful than the Free Syrian Army, and they would take over this weaponry. And all of a sudden, we can see that ISIS is using American Humvees, they're using Toyotas, and they are fighting with M16s, American weaponry in Syria. All these weapons came after they dumped these weapons in Libya, and when they got rid of Gaddafi, they filled all this weaponry into cargo ships and started sending it to Turkey. And from Turkey, they started delivering to Syria. And this was all public information nowadays, right? So ISIS grew thanks to the American support and emerged as an American support to these so-called rebels in Syria. Now, if the Americans cut any sort of support, political, financial, military support, there is not going to be a resurgence of ISIS in Syria. They have small pockets in the Syrian deserts, and the only place that they attack in Syria is Syrian army positions. In the past 2 years, number of attacks against Syrian army soldiers, probably over 200 Syrian soldiers were murdered by ISIS. The number of American sites were attacked by ISIS was zero. Because if you see the map of control, the American forces are on the eastern shore of the Euphrates. And there is water between them, right? And on the western side, on the western shore of the Euphrates, it's the Syrian army. And ISIS pockets are on the western side. And they attack the Syrian army. Desert is a very difficult place to fight. And therefore, if the Americans withdraw from Syria, the fear-mongering that ISIS all of a sudden will become strong, it's illogical, because, first of all, Turkey is not interested to open its borders again, as in 2011, for the multinational jihadists to come to Syria. Saudi Arabia and Qatar will not finance these groups that they used to be, because their priorities have changed in the region. And the third and the fourth is the presence of the Russian forces, the Syrian forces, the Iranian forces or advisors in Syria who are capable of dealing with this threat. The presence of the American forces is actually blocking the Syrian attempt to eradicate ISIS completely, because there is an area in Syria called El Tanaf border crossing. And the Americans occupy this border crossing to block Syria's trade routes to Iraq and to Jordan. And in this place, they have training camps for what they call the rebels. And the ISIS militants, they are on the periphery of this area where the American bases are. And anytime and every time the Syrian forces come close to this area to fight them, the Americans shoot on the Syrian advanced Syrian soldiers. And this has happened so many times. Even Vanessa Bili, who is now Syria based, and she's reporting from Syria, she documented these cases, how ISIS gets protection from the American side to wage attacks against the Syrian army in places that the Syrian army are trying to relocate their forces or sending some reinforcement. They attack all the time the buses that carrying the Syrian soldiers. So no, these pundits in Washington, D.C., who had so much hatred towards Syria and wanted for Assad to be gone, and they were promising everyone that his days are numbered, and their credibility will be put in jeopardy if Assad stays. So they invested so much in this intellectually, financially, career-wise. So they want for Assad to be gone. If he stays in power, then their entire career that they built on the regime change war in Syria will be put also in jeopardy. This is also for them. It's a personal thing, it's a business. These people do not care about the Syrian people. They care about their six-figure salaries in their bank account. So we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the case of Syria has really, it has had such an influence in U.S. foreign policy because the U.S. put so much into it, as you're mentioning there, when it comes to just the sheer propaganda about ISIS. I mean, here in the U.S., we heard about that every night you turn on the news and they're talking about ISIS. Of course, not talking about its origins or how it came to be, but there was just such a focus on it. And for that not to lead to any sort of quote unquote successful results for the United States. Of course, it led to a lot of pain and suffering for the Syrian people. But how do you see that still influencing the situation today, where now the United States not only doesn't have the same kind of stranglehold on the Middle East, but it is being pushed out of the Middle East, and rightfully so, as it is just trying to keep helping Israel and aiding them. And you've got the rest of the region looking at the US and now looking at Israel and saying, we are sick of dealing with you and sick of your antics continuing here.
Actually, when they intervened in Syria, the narrative was, we are here to help the Syrian people to get their freedoms, democracy, etc. And when the war started and Assad managed to liberate most of the areas, and during the course of the liberation, they used to say that if Assad occupies this area, then there will be ethnic cleansing against the Syrian people. Then he will send all these people to the jails, etc., etc. And then when the hostilities were over, like in big cities, in Aleppo, in Deir ez-Zor, in the suburbs of Damascus, people can see that these things had never happened. Like there were no forced displacement like Israel is doing. There were no ethnic cleansing like they claimed. There were no genocide like they claimed. And so the alternative narrative here is that there is this Frankenstein ISIS that can wake up at any moment, so we have to stay in Syria. This is just for the public consumption in the US. Just like they said, Hamas and Hezbollah are infiltrating the borders, the southern borders, and coming to the United States. It's like, who can believe that BS, But the American establishment is so hilarious how they can fool their people, and while we're laughing here at them, Nowadays, time is not in the interest of the US, and they know that. They are clever people, they are masterminds, they're geopolitical masterminds in Washington, D.C., and they can calculate the pros and cons, and they can see how the balance of power is shifting in the region, and where the monetary power is shifting. And there are non-state actors in the US who are very influential, those in the bankers like BlackRock and Vanguard, and these people have investments in the region, in with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, and in Saudi Arabia they're telling them, guys, if you want to continue generating profits, we have to stabilize the region. And if you want to, it is in our economic interest, Saudi Arabia is telling these American bankers, to stabilize the region. I have an economic vision, Saudi Arabia Vision 2030. I'm going to host the World Cup. We have to make peace with Iran, which they did. We have to stabilize the region for our sake. And then we can also normalize relations with Israel if they give a state for the Palestinians. This is the talk. So there are influential people in the US are saying that they have to stabilize the region, and we cannot stay in the Middle East forever, because the strategy of divide and conquer is no more profitable as it used to be 2 decades ago, or even 10 years ago. So with the shift of the monetary power to the East, to China, to Saudi Arabia, these bankers, these investors, they don't have loyalty to the American patriotism or American flag. Their loyalty is for the money. So they will run after and seek to stabilize the region in collaboration with Saudi Arabia. This is the intention. And one of these stabilization, let's say, factors should be that the Americans should withdraw from Iraq and from Syria and stabilize this country, so that the trade routes can flow freely, and one of which is also the Red Sea, right? I mean, the Ansar Allah movement, they're blocking it because of what's happening in the Gaza Strip. And if you saw what the Saudi foreign minister said in Davos when he was interviewed by Fareed Zakaria did his best to just take one condemnation from the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia against Iran or against the Houthis, which in a year or two, if we see back a year or two, they used to fight with blood and weapons, right? The Saudis and the Iranians through the proxies in the region. Now, Saudi Arabia said, we have to deal with the root cause, and that is in the Gaza Strip. This is a spillover from the Gaza Strip in the region. We have to solve in the Gaza Strip, and we cannot go back to the point of status quo before the 7th of October. We have to achieve the aspirations of the Palestinian people, which means a Palestinian state, and then we can speak about us normalizing relations with Israel and the rest of the files in the region. So I think the future is that the Saudis will try to lead these processes in the region. And I think that is positive, and especially that the Saudis and the Iranians are sitting together. And finally, probably the region would live again a normal life that they couldn't, because we had the Carter Doctrine, we had the Bushes coming to the region and like wreaking havoc, in the region so that they can generate profits. And I think this is changing gradually, but surely. We're seeing the change every day, in my opinion, in the region.
Yeah, certainly a lot at stake here, and we're now seeing that blowback after decades of U.S. foreign policy and all of the negative impacts it has had. I appreciate you taking the time to join me today to discuss the latest here. Kevork Almassian, a political commentator and founder of Syriana Analysis. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, check out my page on Patreon. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support.